Hello everybody, welcome back. Yes, we're back to talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons rules, explain, demonstrate, and we'll be doing Dungeons and Dragons 5e today. I've set up I guess I have a bunch of different rules to put forward to you, but this is really an opportunity for everybody to share their ideas and what they do. I'll put up this poll, feel free to take part in that poll. And then we're going to get straight into this fairly quickly. I don't want to muck around, but I'm hoping that people will find this useful. I've run this before. I've done this on my channel, talking about different homebrew rules and how they can work in your game. I've tried a few of these. I would say I've tried not all of them, but certainly some of them. But I'll be putting forward the ones that I have, and a few others that I've come across from other versions of D&D as well. So yeah, let's get started, shall we? Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons 5e and house rules, homebrew rules, whatever you want to call them. This is where I will definitely be doing some demonstration and explanation. So there will be some maps, miniatures, and dice popping up during the session. I do this usually to demonstrate existing rules. And what I'm really not doing today is demonstrating existing rules. What I am demonstrating is what other people have done in their game to change how the rules work. So that's what we're sort of aiming for today. And I'm hoping that you will share your ideas and what you do. So I've got a poll running, but I'm going to also put into chat because I would like people to share how they do things. And what I'll do is each time I go from a different topic or different rules, I'm going to sort of put a hashtag and say this is what I'm covering at this point. That'll just sort of help prompt you so that you're not just sharing every single house rule or homebrew rule all the time. We'll go from one topic to another, and that will sort of help. To give you an idea of the topics I'm probably going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about D20 check or D20 dice roll. I'm going to talk very much about that because it's very much a 5e mechanic. Okay, it's very much a D&D mechanic. I'm going to talk about turn order and initiative, so there'll be an opportunity to discuss that. I'm going to cover critical hits and how they can be done. I've done it a couple of different ways. I'm going to cover cover rules, so you know, if you have cover or something like that. I'm going to talk about character death a little bit. I'm going to talk about inspiration, opportunity attacks, and we might wind up venturing into other areas like legendary actions and damage from monsters. I'm sure there are lots of other things that we can do. I suspect that the discussion of invisibility will come up because it almost always does. So before you start putting in your suggestions, let me just start off with this. Let's start with the D20 dice check. Okay, so hashtag, what are your D20 dice check systems? Do you use what is already existing system? And we'll cover these. Now I'm going to jump back and forth from my head cam to the desk cam so that I can demonstrate stuff as I go. So just so that you've got an idea, this is how I usually do things. I jump back and forth quite a lot from them. Okay, so by all means, just keep an eye on where I am. The head is gone. Okay, I've closed everything up because the dogs are barking. That's right. Okay, so let's start off with, I guess, the first one, which is the dice test. Most dice tests now in 5e consist of a 20-sided dice roll, which is fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. You know, it's a simple way. It's consistent across the board. Normally, they're not. Everything in D&D 5e is consistent. So D20 test. So I'm going to put forward a couple of different ways that I have done it, and maybe other people have done it that you might want to consider incorporating into your game if you're inclined, and we'll see how that pans out for you. Okay, and then once I've sort of covered that topic, I'm going to go back to the chat and I'm going to sort of look through the chat and see what you people have put forward. Now, some of you will be aware of what is called the passive check. Okay, passive checks are when you add 10 to your modifier for whatever sort of skill you are performing. Okay, passive perception is the most common one that we might come across. Passive perception is a big one. So for example here, our wizard, if we were dealing with our wizard, their passive perception would be 10, okay, a 10, and then you would add on to that whatever their wisdom modifier is to figure out what their passive perception is. Usually your perception score is going to be your wisdom score, but you might be proficient with it, so it might be a bit bigger. So let's just say that our wizard has a 3, okay? And that's your standard system. I don't actually use passive perception anymore. The intention behind passive perception I've talked about before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because there are lots of different reasons. It is very much a game master tool, not a player tool, and a lot of people don't understand that. So I don't use those, but I don't do it a lot of dice rolling. So I have some substitutes for how I might approach doing some sort of test or check for my players. Okay, so I have a different approach to dealing with them. So what I want to do is I want to share that with you so you can see how they work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a character sheet. This is an actual character sheet. This is a fighter. And so I'm going to give you a number of circumstances that might crop up, and then I'm going to demonstrate how that test might be conducted. I think that's the easiest way for me to explain how this works. This is where I often use ability checks. But it's not actually an ability check as such. There's no dice roll taking place. I take the dice roll away. And this is to really duplicate the fact that the players' characters are good at stuff. There are certain things they should be able to do without having to make a dice roll, because it's really not that important, that dice roll. So what I use is the ability score. Now, most people will know that Dungeons & Dragons 5e doesn't use ability scores generally. Ability scores don't usually come into play at all. So that means you get that random element, which is fine if you want a random element for every single thing that your players are doing, but I want my players to be able to count on some of the stuff that they're doing. That they can be pretty sure that there's certain things they can achieve most of the time based on what they've got. So this is what I do generally with ability scores. If I need to do something that's related to strength, okay, I will look at I will ask the player to tell me what their strength score is, not what their ability modifier is or their proficiency bonus is or what their skills are. I don't worry about the skills at all. This is actually going very much back to how, in some respects, the basic BECME Dungeons & Dragons would run it, but with a little bit of a twist because there's no dice roll at all. What I do is I use their strength score. If they're going to do something that requires them to be involved in strength, so maybe they're going to jump something, maybe they're going to climb something. So if I decided it was necessary to make a dice check of some kind to climb this tree here, okay, then I would get them to dice roll. But if I decide my DC is only a 15, and they told me that their strength score was a 16, well, 16 is equal to or greater than 15, and so I would say, okay, you climb the tree successfully. You're fine. You can get up there. That's what my DC that I set for climbing that tree was. It's a medium difficulty task, and in this case, you have got such a good strength score, there's no point in you rolling dice. So we don't worry about the 20-sided dice roll, okay? Whereas if I had somebody else who wasn't quite so strong, say a rogue comes into play, and I've set the DC at, as I said, 15 to climb that tree because they want to climb that tree. Okay, and then I would say, okay, what is your strength score? And if they tell me, well, in this case, the rogue's strength score is an 8, well, that's too low. That's too low to be able to just do it. Okay, that doesn't mean they fail. What I do then is I transfer over to the dice roll. This is where I will actually make them make a dice roll, because even though if we think in terms of, the basic sort of physicality and so forth with regard to strength, probably not good enough to just do it without trying to do an active check of some kind. So what I do instead is I say, okay, you can make an athletics check. So what is your athletics score? And they'll tell me, okay, you have an athletics check score, an athletics bonus of -1. And I might decide, well, it's also all right to use acrobatics to climb the tree. So you can use either one. I'm not really too fussed about which one it is. So they say, well, I've actually got a +5 in acrobatics. So can I use that? And I'll say, yes. Yes, you can. You can use either athletics or acrobatics. And then I will get them to roll the dice. Remember, the DC for this climbing this tree is 15. They get a 10 and a 5. That's 15, equal to or greater than. They succeed. This is really the only time that I worry about rolling the dice, if that makes sense. Now, you might be thinking, but Fred, your ability score does not take into consideration that you are trained. No, but the fact that you have proficiency bonuses and so forth, or even a modifier related to your ability score, they're only for the dice roll. Remember, we're using the ability score to actually eliminate the dice roll completely so that we don't waste time. There's a lot of time wasted with people rolling dice, figuring out what their modifier is, and it's very, very quick to just say, what's your strength score? Fine, that's good enough, you succeed. We move on. Okay? It also means that players can be sure that there are certain things they're probably going to succeed on most of the time. That they don't need to worry about the fact that there's a 20-sided dice roll. Anything from a 1 to a 20 could be rolled. So they could fail something they're really good at. It's just dumb luck. Dumb luck. Is that how we want to play the game? And so I don't really want to play the game that way. So this is how I approach it quite a lot. So there's another thing that I want to put forward, and I'm going to demonstrate this a couple of times just because I want to make it clear how I run my game. How you run your game is fine. Let's say we want to make a stealth check, okay? And stealth check, well, that would be dexterity. So if we have, say, the rogue says, I want to hide in the bushes back here. Okay, that's fine. You can hide in the bushes. I've decided that the difficulty class, or maybe, whatever the difficulty class is that I've decided for these bandits here, I may have rolled dice, I may not have rolled dice, I might have used a static number. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say that the DC in this case for these and for them, the bandits, is 11. So that's 11 is the target number. So I'm going to say, okay, what's your dexterity score? And the rogue will say, actually, it's a 16. And I'll say, well, 16 is really good. So you don't need to roll dice because you're not going to have any problems dealing with this situation. Okay, so don't worry about it. We're just going to ignore that. We just assume that you automatically succeed, no dice roll. Whereas if I had somebody else, such as the fighter, trying to hide in the bushes from the bandits, and I had set my DC at 11, and they have a dexterity score of 9. Remember, dexterity score. Well, okay, so that's not good enough because you got a 9. So that's less than, it's not equal to or less than, it's less than. So you have to roll dice in this case. So in this case, I'm going to ask you to make a stealth check. So a 20-sided dice roll comes into play. And then what's the modifier for this? Well, your modifier is really bad. So it's a -1. But you're also wearing heavy armor. So now I will apply disadvantage to that as well. Okay, just like you normally would with D&D 5e. And so then they would roll a dice to see if they succeed. They got disadvantage. They got a 5 and a 1, -1. So that's 4. That's just a 4. Score of 4. 4 is still less than the target number that I've set at 11 in this case. And we move on. So that's how I would do a stealth check using just the dexterity score. Now bear with me because I know this is not a huge selling point for a lot of people. The idea of removing dice rolls seems like a bad thing, But honestly, I've been surprised just how much my players like it. They can be guaranteed that there are certain things they've got a very good chance of being successful on and do not need to worry about the dice roll itself. Constitution score doesn't usually come up very often, not unless you're doing something like, holding your breath and things like that. So I don't usually use that as a check, or even the score most of the time. So Constitution's very rare as a thing. But intelligence. So intelligence, let's say we have a wizard here, and they're going to try to make a knowledge check on something. All right, maybe they want to make a knowledge check on these bandits because they can see there's a tattoo on them. They've got like a dragon tattoo, and they want to do sort of like I want to know a little bit about the history of that tattoo. I can see it on them. What's the likelihood that I actually know something about that? Well, going and looking at the wizard's character sheet, they've got an intelligence of 16. They're really intelligent. So they've done a lot of book reading. They've probably learned a lot of stuff. They may not necessarily be proficient or trained in history, but their general knowledge should be pretty good. So 16. Now, what's the DC I've set for this? Let's say the DC I've set for this is a 14. It's not quite medium difficulty, okay? So it's a 14. And so in this case, they succeed because their intelligence score is a 16. But if we had somebody else doing this, say our fighter was trying to figure out the tattoo and where it came from. So a local guild that deals with devil worship or something like that. Well, their intelligence is only an 11. So if they wanted to know about the tattoo on those bandits, well, they're going to fail. And again, we go back to, okay, let's get you to make a dice roll in this case because your intelligence score is too low. We're not going to use that. So there will be a dice roll required in this case. And then we'll look at things like, what modifier do we add to that? If they don't have things like, if they have history as a trained skill, then I'll use history. Okay, cool. They've got a proficiency in history. You can have that. That's fine. We'll add that on. There's your 2. You don't have anything for your intelligence modifier, but we just roll the dice and let's see what you get. And I rolled a 6 on this dice. Add 2. It's 8. That's not enough. You needed to have at least a 14. So you still fail in this case, but there was a chance, if the dice were on your side, of being successful. There will be certain things that I won't do that. Well, knowledge checks are tricky. I always find that knowledge checks are difficult. I'm only going to be dealing with sort of basic information if I'm going to be doing something like this with the intelligence score. Okay. If it's really complicated and very specific to something like, what do you know about the hooked horror? And I say, well, it's a hooked horror. You don't need to make a dice roll for that. It's a hooked horror. But do I know anything else about hooked horrors? Well, unless you've been trained, probably not. Probably not. Unless, of course, you've come across them before during your adventures, then maybe I would change the way I do that. I always find that knowledge checks are a tricky one. So there's got to be some sort of play back and forth with this. Okay. Let's try another one here. A really common one is your perception check or your wisdom check, right? When you want to sort of notice something. So, for example, let's take these bandits and let's stick them in the bushes. This is a very common thing where they decide to hide, right? They're hiding from you. You may not notice them because they're in the bushes and they're doing their very best to be unseen and unheard. So how would I approach this in this situation, given that's what we're dealing with? Well, the first thing is I would decide on a number for them. Usually what I will do is I will just take whatever the stat block says for their main skill. They've set themselves up. They didn't have to rush it or anything like that. I'll just take their dexterity score, often as that's their check number. So maybe it's a 10. So 10 is the number. So they're kind of it might even be a little bit higher than that, depending on if I think that they've had plenty of time to set up, then maybe I'll make it another 5 points higher. So maybe it's a 15 in this case. So it's going to be quite difficult. It's a medium difficulty to actually do this. So as we're journeying along, each player who has a character here has a different chance of being successful. So for example, I'm going to use wisdom. Wisdom is perception. Okay, I'm not going to use the perception score or a check as such. I'm just going to use the wisdom score itself. And so the fighter, well, they've got a 13. Well, unless they make a dice roll, they're not going to notice anything. So the fighter, you have to roll a 20-sided dice. Okay, but if I'm dealing with a different character in terms of their score, since they had a 13 and it didn't have a 15, if I'm dealing with, say, the wizard, and the wizard has a 12, again, 12 is not enough, so they're going to have to make a dice roll. Okay, all right. This sometimes works well, and sometimes it doesn't change anything. Wisdom, 10 for the rogue. So the rogue's only got 10 for, so they're going to have to make a dice roll as well. And then lastly, the cleric. Now the cleric has a 16. Now that means I'm not going to ask the cleric to make a dice roll, a perception check. As they're moving along the road looking for danger, this is the one character that doesn't need to make a dice roll, as far as I'm concerned, because their wisdom score is so good. So I'm going to leave them be, but everybody else in the group, that's a different story. I will make them perform that dice roll. So somebody like the rogue, okay, they have their modifier, which is like basically the 0. They've got no sort of modifier for their perception. So they just roll a flat dice and they get a 6. Well, that's not 15 or more, so they fail. They don't notice the bandits. And then we move on and we do the wizard, and the wizard's got a perception bonus of 3. There it is. Okay, they've got proficiency and they've got their bonus from wisdom, so it's a 3. So fine, like they get 3, and they roll their 20-sided dice, and we see what we get. 12 and 3, it's 15. So they actually do hear or see the bandits in the bushes. Okay, so the wizard's aware of them. And then the last one would be, say, your fighter. And if I did I grab the wrong one? I may have grabbed the wrong one. There we go. And then the last one would be the rogue. Is it the rogue? Did I do the fighter before? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, something like that. You get the gist. You get the idea. And I find that this quite often eliminates a lot of the dice rolling that I don't need players to make. And it also reinforces the importance of making sure that your character overall at its basic structure is really strong at doing stuff, like, you know, and that the scores are actually got some importance. Ability scores are not just redundant on the character sheet for me. They're actually highly important. So I just wanted to sort of demonstrate that to you and see what you thought in terms of a concept. I don't know that you'll necessarily want to transfer that over to your own game. I'll say it again, I've found that my players have really enjoyed that. They like the idea that there are things that they are going to be successful at, generally most of the time. A lot of you might have noticed there's already a mechanic in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. If you were not aware, when it comes to making a long jump in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, they use the ability score. Did you notice that? It's the one time and only time in Dungeons & Dragons 5e where they actually use the ability score. It's really strange. So what they've done here is, if you are trying to jump, say, 10 feet, and you have a running jump of at least 10 feet, and you do a jump over, which of course, give yourself enough space, you can do that. So you only have to jump over 10 feet of whatever the distance is. As long as the score, your strength score, is 10 or more, you succeed. There's no dice roll required. Did you notice that? Did anybody notice in 5e rules, the raw, that's how the long jump works? So that means if you're trying to jump over a distance of 15 feet and you have a strength score of 15 or 16, you don't have to make a dice roll. But if it's less than that, then you would have to make a dice roll. So they have included one example of this with just one part of the rules. And I actually think it's a very, very clean and efficient way to deal with the game. I wish they do it more often. I think it would be such a departure from what people are used to, but also players like rolling dice. Even though they might get some shitty results, players often really like rolling dice. When I first did this, my players were not too sure about it. And as soon as they started putting it into play, they were like, oh, Oh, yeah, I like that much more. But you wouldn't know it until you've done it, I think, in many respects. Anyway, I want to have a quick look at chat, and I want to go over some other stuff that I do in my games and other homebrew rules around the D20 dice roll check, okay? Hello, Jeeves, how are you going? I don't know if you're still here, but I hope that you are, for those of you who are still hanging around. I know I explained this quite a lot. I gave you quite a few different demonstrations of how it might work. Fred Huber, only in combat to hit rolls are nat 1s or nat 20 special. So what Fred Huber is saying is that you only get a natural 1 or a natural 20 in combat for to hit rolls. So this is actually standard Dungeons and Dragons 5e. This rule is not a special rule. It does apply in Fred Huber's case, I believe, because he's using advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So he does have in combat nat 1s is going to be a failure, and a nat 20 or natural 20 is going to be a success, but only for attack rolls. This has been carried over to 5e, so this is actually a standard rule. But they don't apply it to saving throws, and they don't apply this sort of thing to ability checks or skill checks in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. I will sometimes adjust success failure results by how far they are from the required roll. Right, fair enough. Okay, yep. What do you got here, Jeeves? I admittedly always forget about passive perception. I think a lot of people don't like passive perception. One, because they feel like, I think game masters feel like passive perception causes them a lot of trouble. And, when it's set up to be a player tool rather than a game master tool, then they have issues with it. So if they can't get it to work the way they need it to do, and the players are using it a different way, particularly if they're picking up like a feat like Observant, then they will ditch the entire system and just will not use passive perception or passive checks at all, when it was intended to actually try to make their life a little bit easier and run the game a little bit faster. But yeah. There is a bit of a problem with, I guess, I guess people will say there's always a problem when you know exactly what the numerical result will be. When you know exactly what the numerical result will be, then you can metagame. And this is really a product of how well you trust your group, and I've played with my group for a long time, and how likely you think it is that they will metagame. Yeah? Old school ability check was roll versus ability. Yes. Yeah, so another way of doing it, believe it or not, if you look at basic Beck Me Dungeons and Dragons, they would look at it this way. Like you would have your character and you would have an ability score. Say if we're dealing with strength and climbing up, the rogue decides to climb up the tree, and you had a strength score of 8, you would just roll a 20-sided dice. You wouldn't add anything to that dice roll. It was just a straight roll. And the idea is you wanted to get less than or equal to that number. If you got greater than that number, you were unsuccessful. This is basic Beck Me Dungeons and Dragons, which I probably will demonstrate. So if I roll a 20, I would fail. So that meant that because of my 8, I had a less than 50% chance of being successful generally on a 20-sided dice roll. Yeah, so I wasn't going to be very good at it. The bigger the number, the better, and that would be Beck Me Basic D&D, which is what Fred Huber's mentioning. Okay, you could probably apply a similar system to Dungeons and Dragons 5e if you had people who were, particularly if you've got a group who like playing the older game, but you still want to try to include some modern game mechanics. I think the approach that I have probably works better, just to eliminate the dice roll completely. But, whatever works for you. Get equal to or lower to succeed, like Thaco. It's an inverted roll. Yeah, you're right, exactly. Osiris, admittedly, that could be easier than doing a complex equation for spell save DCs with 8 plus int modifier, proficiency modifier. Yeah, that's true. I don't generally apply what I showed you before where I used the ability scores. I don't usually apply that to a saving throw, and I don't usually apply that to an attack roll, obviously. Okay, skill checks only come up when they can't succeed with the ability score check the way that I've run it. You also pass notes. Players can tell others what the note says or lie. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so let's go over another rule that I've kind of used, something that you may or may not be using in your game, and that is you can ditch the entire skill system if you like. I've seen people do this before, and just make everything an ability check. Okay, you still have a dice roll involved. There's still a 20-sided dice roll. You still have a modifier that you add, whatever that modifier might be, but you just eliminate this. And what you do is, instead of saying that you have proficiency in acrobatics, you just say you have proficiency in dexterity. That's a lot of homebrew rules and a lot of things you have to modify, but I know some people who do it. I was quite kind of surprised that they have sort of decided that they wanted to eliminate the skill system completely, and proficiency just means you get your proficiency bonus to the ability check, and you still dice rolling. So that's an interesting way to sort of look at it, honestly, if you ask me. So for those of you who are hankering back to trying to play some old AD&D, another thing that I do in my game, and I've covered this before and explained it quite a lot, is generally I have a 20 on a dice roll. Right now in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, if you roll a 20, so I make an attack, like if I'm playing the game and my fighter is about to attack somebody, I'm just going to get rid of this. And where's that character? Yeah, there it is. That's what I want. Let's just use this as an example. So right now, if you look at how the game works, you add your bonus, you roll your dice, okay? And if you roll on your attack a 20, if I can ever find the 20 now that I've rolled the dice, there we go, there's the 20. If I rolled a 20, it's an automatic success, which basically means it's automatic hit, okay? It doesn't really matter what the 5 is anymore. Frankly, it's unimportant. So we already apply this sort of thing in 5e. This rule already exists, right? It's already there. And the bonus means nothing if you roll a 20. But not only is a 20 for an attack roll a automatic success, it's also a critical hit. So it does a lot more damage than normal. And that's just related to making attacks. But I've applied this rule to all of the 20-sided dice rolls. So if you were making like if you had to make a dice roll to do an ability check or a skill check in my case, okay, what I would say is whatever that modifier is, say if you're doing, dealing with athletics in this example, here's the +5, and you got a 20, it doesn't matter what the 5 is. The fact that you rolled a 20, there should always be a chance if you roll a dice. I always believe that if you're making players roll dice in the first place, there should always be a chance they succeed. If you decided that whatever they tried to do was impossible, then never ask them to roll the dice in the first place. If the players roll the dice before you ask for the dice roll, ignore the dice roll. That's what I do. It's not up to the players to decide when you make a skill check, an ability check. Really, it's just not up to them. Now the attack roll is different because it's an attack roll. Okay. It's you as the game master, and this is how I sort of approach it. So I make a 20 for an ability check or a skill check or an attack roll, automatic success. But I also do that with a saving throw, because again, my view is it's a 5% chance on a dice roll that they might succeed. And if you roll a dice and you could never succeed, why are you rolling the dice in the first place? It's kind of like, and this is kind of how I've viewed it for a while, it's kind of like saying you have a chance to do something and be successful. Let's see if you succeed on this. And then saying, look, now that you've rolled the dice and you got the best result you possibly can on the dice roll, ha ha ha, you don't succeed. It's really shite. So I don't do that. And honestly, I've not found it being a problem. That 5% chance of success on an ability check, a skill check, or a saving throw, and expanding it on. Do you know older versions of Dungeons and Dragons actually allowed for a 20 on the dice roll to be a success? things like ability checks or skill checks, it applied this. If you roll a 20, you succeeded. They took that away. It did exist. It's never applied to a saving throw, I understand. So I use that quite a lot in my games. And I do it primarily because if I'm going to waste their time getting them to dice roll, I want them to have some potential payoff. Rather than doing what I just described, which is basically you roll the best result you possibly can, but you still fail. No matter what your modifier is, your modifier puts you down below, it's not going to work. Like, it's just if you're going to do that, just don't bother asking for the dice roll. Because, you don't have to ask for a saving throw from your players. If you feel like it's just not warranted, just don't ask for it. I do that all the time if I think it's unnecessary. Same thing with ability checks and and skill checks. Anyway, so I thought I'd at least share that with you. Let's go over another one, and that is rolling a 1. Like, what if you roll a 1? Right now, if you're making an attack, right, and you roll a 1, no matter what the bonus is, you fail. It doesn't matter how good you are at it, you're just going to fail. So my view, just like rolling a 20, is that if you are asking them to roll the dice in the first place, but they could never possibly fail that check because they rolled a 2, yeah, they've got a 2 on their dice roll, and their modifier is like 10, and the DC was 11, then and the DC is how am I just trying to describe this? If I'm trying to get them to make a dice roll and there's no chance of them failing because the DC is 10, okay, then I don't know, why did I even bother getting them to roll the dice? If their modifier they're adding to their 20-sided dice roll is 10, then why would I bother? I just wouldn't ask for the dice roll. So this is why I tend to do this as well. We do it with an attack roll. I see no right and problem with doing it with an ability check, a skill check, or even a saving throw. I've covered this before on my channel, people. It's pretty obvious. Again, it's one of those things where I'm going to waste your time getting you to make a dice check when you don't really need to, because there would be no point in doing so. So now if I decide that there is going to be, even though they've got a really good bonus, there is still a chance and they roll a 1, then they can still fail. This is kind of like, this is very much me looking at it and thinking, is there a way of me eliminating a dice roll that is unnecessary in the case of this particular person? I guess that's how I'm sort of seeing it. And another thing that I do, and I don't know if necessarily everybody sort of feels the same way, but generally I find in Dungeons and Dragons that things like DC 5 and 10 are just so pathetic. So DC 5 or 10, I don't bother with those DCs. I don't even look at them and consider them worthwhile. Even if even if maybe say their ability score is under 10, I just generally just don't worry too much about it, because if you think in terms of 5e and what does DC 5 mean? Difficulty class 5 means it's very easy. So very easy, you're probably never going to fail that task. Very easy is like, I blow my nose. I eat a piece of food with my fork. I'm going to go and wipe my backside when I go to the toilet. I mean, it's very easy. So I climb a ladder. I get onto a chair. You don't usually fail these things. So there's just no point. And in an adventuring environment, I just don't think there's much point worrying about them. And then that's very easy. But 10 is still easy. Both of these, I mean, even though we've got the scale of 5 through to 30, I just basically ignore 5 and 10 and only deal with anything above 10. So 11 through to 30 is really the scale that I use. I just don't see that there's any point in doing anything else with it, with regard to that sort of stuff. And that's sort of how I approach it with regard to making checks. Now, you might be thinking, well, Fred, I thought does this mean, the way that you do things, does that means that impossible tasks can be performed? No, because you don't allow them to perform impossible tasks. You don't allow a dice roll for that. There's never going to be a chance. You just say it doesn't happen. Or if there's no chance they could possibly fail, then again, it doesn't supersede that. It's just you must have decided as a game master there must be a possibility of there being some sort of failure given the circumstance. Do you know what I mean? DC is impossible is why I adjust how badly they fail based on the roll. Failing a climb check by 1, fall 5 feet, failing by 25, might fall all the way down the cliff. Yeah, you can have a progression. So there are a lot of people who have a progression of DC. So when you fail to a certain degree. So it's not just you succeed or you fail and that's it. So there are progressions of failure and success. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. There's a lot of work involved in doing something like that, I've always found, but certainly you can do something like that. Now, I want to go over initiative, but I need to go to the toilet. And it's pretty clear to me that this is not going to be a high volume live stream today, which is fine. I'm going to take a quick break, probably less than 5 minutes, come back, and we'll be dealing with next. I'm going to deal with initiative, turn order. So for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing, this is where my head is going, is different types of turn order and initiative and how it can be played out. And I would like to sort of demonstrate some ideas around that. So I'll put forward that right now while you are here, and you can feel free to put in your ideas. Hashtag. How do you apply initiative? There's a lot of different ways you can do it. So yeah. Now, why am I not getting this right? Initiative. I think that's got it. How do you apply initiative? Lots of different ways. Okay, I'm going to be back in 5 minutes or less, and I'll go over that. Let's get in here. Pardon me. Okay, all right. So let's go back to where we were, and I was talking about turn order. Do you know one of the worst things about Dungeons and Dragons is turn order? I mean, you could say it's a great thing, but I think it's actually a bad thing. It's one of the things that really sort of messes with the narrative of a game and codifies it and gamifies it in such a way that everything just slows down to a crawl. Because turn order, the only reason to have turn order in Dungeons and Dragons is to be able to manage the table. Okay? That's the only reason. So how you do it probably doesn't matter. And this is where I generally have approached it a couple of different ways. And this is partly due because of I've played a few different games now and a few different versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and I've seen how other game systems are doing it. And there's some really clever ways of solving the problem of slow combat and getting things moving. Because once you go from your narrative, you describe something happens, and then now we go into turn order and everybody rolls initiative, and you're waiting for people to roll dice and do stuff. If you're on a virtual tabletop, it's a little bit easier. Yeah. I think, granted, that's definitely a thing. You know, turn order can make a big difference in terms of that aspect of the game. But this is hear me out. This is how I kind of see the initiative problem, because it is like a huge departure from what you were doing before. It was highly narrative, and suddenly going down to, yeah, we do things this way because we do it this way because I don't know. Why do we do it this way? Is it because we've always done it that way? Frankly, it's not true, because there were different ways of dealing with initiative and turn order in the past. So I'm going to put forward a couple of different ideas. And Shy X, hello, how are you? What I want to do is I want to show you the simplest method of initiative that I've ever seen. And it's really obvious. And the first one is go clockwise or go anti-clockwise around the table. And who do you start with? Now, some people say, I'm going to start with the game master. Or somebody will say, we're going to start with the person in this chair. I've always been of the opinion that the fight itself is always initiated by somebody doing something violent or threatening. And so they should always be the person who starts first. Do you know what I mean? So if the bandits decide to rush or draw a sword, they are the one that whoever drew the sword or tried to fire the arrow or cast the spell or charge the players. That's who should go first. So that would be one example of when the game master or dungeon master has the monsters act first. Now, it might be just one of the monsters in the group. It might be the entire group just rush out of the bushes and charge in at you. Okay, and so they would get to go first, and then the players, they would go after. Okay, so you would go clockwise or anti-clockwise from the game master if the monsters or the creatures are going first, because they did something that was threatening. But if you have somebody in the group who decides to do something that initiates the whole thing, okay, maybe they're bargaining and talking on the road, and then the wizard says, "I cast fireball." Now, I know what you're thinking. There's a problem if the player who plays a wizard is always saying, "I cast fireball," then the players are always going to be going first. I suppose that's true, but not necessarily, depending on the narrative. Do you know what I mean? Just because they have called out in the middle of your playing session, "I cast fireball," there might have been something happening at that time that sort of negates that. So, but if the discussion and the parlay between the players and the bandits are starting to wear down, and the fighter says, "I charge into the leader because he's clearly not worth bargaining for. He's asking for 30 gold pieces to pass down the road or get past them, and actually, yeah, the toll is too high. I'm not paying the toll." They charge in an attack. I would let that player go first, okay, and then we would just go clockwise or anti-clockwise around the table. It might be a player or the game master who goes next. I don't know. Depends on where people are positioned. So I always feel like that's a good way of approaching turn order, clockwise or anti-clockwise. Start off with whoever initiated the fight in the first place, so there's no ridiculous crazy things. Because you know when you have in a turn order and the person who actually did the thing that was offensive or started the fight in the first place rolls really low, and yet they're the one going last, yet they're the person who did something that was threatening. It doesn't make any sense. It's like a narrative cognitive break. It's really, really strange. It happens in my game all the time with the people that I play with. And every time I'm a game master, I try not to let that happen if I can help it. I always try to let whoever did the threatening thing is the one who actually gets to start the fight. And then everybody else will go clockwise or anti-clockwise if I'm going to do that. Now, I don't sit at a table anymore, so I can't do that anymore. So I have to use a different approach. There's another approach you can use, which I find highly interesting, and it goes right back to basic Back Me Dungeons and Dragons, and that is where you roll a 6-sided dice. So what essentially happens is somebody in the group of players is designated the person who will roll the 6-sided dice. They roll their dice, they get a 6. Great. They don't add anything to that dice roll. It's called group initiative. It's a different type of group initiative. There's many different types. And then the game master or dungeon master, they roll for the monsters. Okay, we get a tie. This would mean both sides go at the same time, which means you resolve everything. Okay, even if somebody is taken out of the fight, they will still get to make an attack and move. Okay, it's still going to be part and parcel of the game. But at the end of the round, then, if somebody goes down because they're at 0 hit points, then they go down. But if you're dealing with, Game Master rolls low, they got a 4, that means the players go first, all the players go first, and then the Game Master uses their monsters or creatures. If it's the other way around, they say they roll, they've got a 4, but the player got a 3, then the players go last, and the Game Master goes first. Group initiative. Now, that you can do it a couple of different ways. You could do this dice roll once at the beginning of the fight, or you could do it every single round. So that means that each round, because it's such a fast mechanic, one person rolls the dice, you just read off the number, and the dungeon master reads off the dice. So that means that potentially every single round, depending on what you roll, the fight becomes a little bit different. So now, Game Master goes first, players go last. The next round, you roll dice, okay, and this time the players go first and the Game Master goes last. So you can actually change up the order of play. Group initiative is a very, very interesting way to approach things. I really like it. It's one of the things that makes Back Me Basic D&D stand out. I don't know why they did not consider this a viable option for Dungeons and Dragons 5e, because it's super simple. It would have. It's not even there. It's not even in the Dungeon Master Guide as an optional rule. Yet the rule has existed. Granted, that was during the TSR days, for sure. Okay, so that is the 6-sided dice roll group initiative. Anti-clockwise and clockwise play. There's another thing that I also have done, and you may or may not like this idea. I find that players don't tend to like this approach, but it does eliminate a lot of dice rolling and mucking around. And this is what I do. Okay, forget about dice rolls. We're not going to do that. Instead, what I do is I just get everybody in the group to tell me what their initiative modifier is, or their dexterity modifier, whichever it might be, okay, depending on what you're trying to do. So that means so the rogue's got a 3, so they're going to go at the top. The wizard's got a 2, so they're going to go after them. The fighter's got a -1, so they can go here. And the cleric's got a -1, so it doesn't really matter. They can be right beside each other. And then with the monster, whatever type of monster it is, I just slip them in. I don't even bother rolling dice. I just slip them into wherever they would fit within this. And if they have the same dexterity modifier or the same initiative modifier, then I just have the players go after the Game Master. Because initiative is really important in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Most battles only last 1 to 3 rounds. You need to be able to do something with your monsters before it's all over. So, if the Game Master's only got a 0 or a 0 thing, I would just slot them in here. If they're only got a modifier for their dexterity of 0 and their initiative is like 0, if they were to make a dice roll, which we're not going to worry about, I would just slot them in here. And so that means they're going to go after the rogue, go after the wizard, and then they'll take their turn, and then the fighter and the cleric get to go. And frankly, it doesn't really matter too much, So you don't have to ever worry about that couple of minutes that you spend collecting up all the initiatives and then putting it into order. It's always going to be exactly the same. People will get used to it. I don't find that this is a very popular technique with players who are used to rolling dice. but it certainly makes your life so much easier as a game master or a dungeon master. Now, I've shown people before my variation on how I go about doing initiative, and I'm going to do that in a second, but I want to go through the chat. It takes me just a little bit of time just to roll some dice to demonstrate this process to you. Nowadays, I use a combination of 5e initiative and group initiative, and I generally tend to do things like once. But before I do that, let me just jump over to here. Okay, and go through the chat, because I see a few people have been sharing their ideas about initiative. Each creature gets an initiative roll. This spaces PC's turns between enemies' turns, so less crunch on one side, destroying all of the others being before they can act. Okay, all right. So I see why Fred Huber's, what he's saying is, instead of using a batched approach to creatures with their initiative, every single creature gets an initiative roll, and then they're spaced out amongst the PCs who also have an initiative roll. And the idea is that instead of all the bandits all going at the same time, they could be spread out. That would be quite hard. I've done that sort of thing before. It's quite hard to keep track. It can be a little bit confusing at times, but if you're capable, then certainly by all means. But I know exactly what you're talking about, Fred Huber. If anybody in chat doesn't, let me know. Shy X, they provide 3 variants to initiative. You can mix and match to your likes to make it swift and smooth. Yep. I really like chase scenes. Okay. Next, I've done. Everyone writes their turn plan and hands it in. So what Fred Huber's talking about is that everybody has to put forward what they plan to do before anything is resolved. And so that means that everybody gets to do something essentially. You're kind of locked in. There's none of this, I'm going to change my plan because somebody else did something else. Because this tends to happen, right? Somebody will do something, and then the next person in the turn order and D&D 5e will then decide to change their plan. I'm not going to cast Fireball now because they're too close to everybody else. I'm going to cast something else. I just don't know what it is. I just need a moment to figure that out. So that kind of eliminates that. If you have to put your plan forward at the very beginning before you unravel everything, I can see how that might work. There's certainly a nice way of, I wouldn't do that myself, but I can see there's a lot of people who do this. I know that it's very common in older versions of D&D. I find a modified speed factor can make games feel different. All actions move their initiative. It feels great. Dual wielding, light weapons. Yeah, so let me go back to here. And I'm going to show you my form of initiative, which is a variation on 5e, okay, using group initiative. A lot of people may have noticed that there used to be a suggestion that depending on the type of character that you have, if you cast a spell, then you would have a 4-sided dice. You would roll a 4-sided dice, and whoever got the highest number would be going first. So if your wizard rolled a 3, that would be what their initiative is. The fighter, because they were using a weapon, okay, and it was probably going to be a bit faster in terms of how it resolved things, that there wasn't as much to do, they would get to roll an 8-sided dice. So you would roll the 8-sided dice and you get a 7. So that's in their initiative. So they're more likely to go first. Then, say, a cleric might have a d6 because, it's sort of a combination of casting a spell or something like that. It might be that they're making a ranged attack, for example. Maybe ranged attacks, you get a d6. If you're going to make a ranged attack, you get a d6. You roll a d6, that's your initiative. 6, and in this case, roll, I get a 5, okay? In older versions of Dungeons and Dragons, what they did is they just separated and said that certain things went first. Usually, if you cast a spell or you used a magic item, you went last. If you made a melee attack, you got to go first. If you made a ranged attack, you got to go after the melee attack people. So the turn order was determined based on what you were trying to do. So you don't even have to roll dice. That actually works really fast. I found that Wally DM's approach to using initiative is very, very quick and smart too. So a lot of different ways you can approach it. Now, this is how I do my initiative in my game. I've demonstrated this a few times. So I have all of the bonuses for the characters here. And so what I do is I ask everybody, before we even start the session, as they're coming into the group, at the very beginning of my session, I will get them to roll their dice. So for the rogue, they get a 14, and we're adding a, say, a 3. Okay. So that's going to be 17. 14 equals 17. So that's their initiative. Great, okay, and then the next person shows up, and it's the person who's going to be playing the wizard. And I say, okay, roll me initiative before we start. So I use this just in case there's a fight. I don't know that there's going to be a fight during our game session, but there might be. So 2 and 7 comes to 9 for the wizard. And then say if we're dealing with the cleric and the fighter, they get a -1, and so they roll initiative as well, and I get a 2 for the fighter, so he gets a 2, and -1, it comes to 1. The cleric rolls their dice, and they get a 13, so they add 13 to a -1, it comes to 12. And then I roll for my creatures, and let's just say that the modifier for them is it's just a +1. Okay, so I've got a 1, and I'll roll that. And the only person who needs to roll initiative again, if I have different monsters, is me as the game master. The player's initiative is now set for the entire session. Okay, so I rolled a 1, I got a 1 for my modifier, 10 is what I rolled. So in this case, for these creatures, we've got 11. So then I just put it all into order while they're chatting and getting to know each other, and everybody's rolling in. So Rogue's going to go first. The Cleric's going to be going next because they're the next highest. I'm going to take myself out for now, okay, because, you know, they might not be fighting these guys. I might be fighting goblins for all I know. So we've got Cleric, and then we're going to have our Wizard in here, and then we're going to have our fighter going last. Okay, and then my initiative, if we wind up with a battle taking place at some point, they've already done their initiative. I don't have to wait for them anymore, okay? And I just leave their initiative the same for the entire session. Now I just take this, and once I've rolled it, since I can do that, it's just me, I'm only going to worry about myself getting my act together and rolling the dice and adding the modifier. I can drop that in real quick. So it doesn't, I don't waste a lot of time. So it's going to be dropped in right here, just between. So that this is what happens during a fight. I'll say, well, the rogue and the cleric get to go first. What do you do? And whoever comes out with whatever they want to do first, I say, okay, now roll your dice. Okay, the rogue, you're going to move up and you're going to use sneak attack on somebody. Great, fine, do that. Roll the dice. I don't wait for them to roll their dice and then calculate everything. I couldn't care less. And then I go, okay, what are you doing, cleric? And the cleric says, I'm going to cast bless on everybody. Okay, I'm going to cast bless on myself and 2 other people. Great, cool, do that. And that's what I do. Once those 2 have resolved their turns, and this gives the person who was rolling dice at the first time round time to actually get it done. By the time I've found out what the cleric's doing, the numbers and the details from the rogue are coming through. So then I can then deduct and make whatever changes to the monster stat block on the in terms of hit points and make all those adjustments. Once I've finished with the rogue, the cleric's probably already determined who's going to be having bless. It might have been the rogue. It might not have been the rogue. But this all moves a lot faster that way. That means those 2 people have done their turn. Whoever moves the farm has a plan about what they're going to do is the person who goes first, because honestly it doesn't matter. And then I go. And so I will do whatever I'm going to do. Or maybe I'm going to move up and attack, you know. The rogue has moved up and tried to attack this individual, and they've moved out of the bushes, and there's people sort of moving into and vying to do things. That's all cool. So I take my turn, make my attacks. I'm finished. Now I say, wizard, fighter, it's your turn. And so what you'll find is wizards and spellcasters take a long time to do stuff because they're casting spells, and they have to read things. And the fighter will say, well, I'm going to move in here, and I'm going to attack both of these. So they make their attack rolls and so forth, and they've done their turn. And the wizard will then say, okay, I cast this spell, and I want to cast I don't know, fireball. I want to cast fireball, but I want to try to avoid missing as many of my comrades as possible, but getting as many enemies as I can. I say, okay, you can lay it down there. There you go. Boom. Okay, you've hit everybody apart from one of the bandits. Sweet. What are the numbers? So this speeds up gameplay. It means a single round of gameplay in my game will take anywhere from 30 seconds, depending on how many monsters I have to deal with, because I use average damage as well with my monsters, and I roll a 6-sided dice and add that to my average damage. So that's how they do damage. It's possible for it to take 30 seconds. It might take just a couple of minutes to do one round of combat. That doesn't mean that every person's turn is 1 or 2 minutes to actually complete. No, it means the entire fight's usually finished within less than 5 minutes. Because I keep doing that, we keep going through, and each round, by the time we've done 3 rounds, it's mostly done. It's mostly finished. And if I decided, okay, well, we're done with these, the bandits have been sorted out, they're traveling again, and this time, goblins attack. There's a fight amongst goblins. And the goblins sort of, jump out at them, and I want to have a fight with them. Well, then I just look at what is the initiative modifier for a goblin. It's 2, which is the same as the wizard. It's the same as it's a 2. So I would just have 2, and then I just roll a dice quickly. Got a 6 equals 8, and I just chuck that in. Where does that mean? That means that I am now here. Everybody's going to get to go before me apart from the fighter. I don't bother changing their initiative, because now it's a different fight. I'm the only one who had to roll dice, so it takes a lot less time to get it done. So I say, rogue, cleric, wizard, you guys get to go first. Who's doing what? They tell me what they're going to do. They do it. We move on. We've finished. I take my turn, okay? And then the last person to go is the fighter, because they are at the very bottom of the initiative. That's it. And trust me, man, it makes fights so much more tactical for the players. It speeds up the process, and it's not unusual in a 2-hour session for me to have 2 or 3 fights, and most of that fight time, okay, doesn't take up that 2 hours. It might take 3 fights, might take me 15 minutes, 5 minutes each. That's it. That's how quick it is. This is why I use that system. It's my favorite way of applying initiative to Dungeons and Dragons 5e, just to get better results in terms of speed. I like combat, but I like my combat fast. Always been sort of the biggest hiccup I've always found with Dungeons and Dragons. So what do you got here? AD&D had speed factors for equipment and casting times of spells in fractions of a round. I believe, yeah, true. Yeah, that's very true. How's it going, Cal-Rel? How are you? The wizard spells might calculate to go off middle of the next round. Yeah, that's some complicated stuff for sure. Okay, so that's initiative, but we're not finished. Let's deal with critical hits, because critical hits been around a long time, and I mean, there's so many different ways you can do it. How do you do critical hits? Hashtag. How do you do critical hits? Critical hits. I think that's it. Cool. Right. Let's move over to critical hits. And I might just, for the sake of my sanity, just get rid of this and just write this down here. Critical hits. I might need a lozenge or 2. I'm getting a bit dry. It's a hot day in my office right now. Not what I was hoping for. So whether you realise it or not, Dungeons & Dragons has dealt with critical hits differently for a long time. Every version of Dungeons & Dragons has often had a different critical hit system. Literally, that's how complicated it used to be. They have never been able to sort of nail it down. Critical hit. So, Now we know how a critical hit in 5e already works, so I'm not going to bother explaining that again. There's no point. So instead, I'm going to describe some of the different techniques that I've come across and that I've used, and you will share yours. Okay. First off, I have come across people who have never used critical hits. They just remove the idea that rolling a 20 is a critical hit. They might still apply the idea that rolling a 20 on a 20-sided dice roll, even though it's not a critical hit, it's still an automatic hit. So you still hit automatically, doesn't matter what bonus you add. But they just don't worry about having any critical hits at all. Do you know what this does? It means that you can't be critically hit and killed by a monster at low level. That's one of the benefits of just removing the critical hit completely. Get rid of it. It also means that players can't do critical hits. Monsters can't do critical hits. So there's no huge, because critical hits are the big swingy thing in D&D. They always throw things out the most. They're the things that will cause the most trouble in your game and make your battles the most swingy. So if you get rid of critical hit, then you have really very few problems to deal with. But if you want to apply critical hits into a game and you want it to do something, there are so many different ways you can do it. So for example, if I have a rogue and they make a fighter, let's say it's a fighter, have a fighter and they're making an attack, okay, let's say they have a great axe, no, let's just say they have an axe, okay, and they get their critical hit, they get their 20 on their dice roll, okay, wonderful, awesome, added that, and they do damage. And so they will add whatever their strength score is, so maybe that's a 3, and they roll a 8-sided dice, say, and then because it's a critical hit, they get to roll a second damage dice. So you roll another damage dice. And that's it. And so you add that up, and that's how much damage you do. Okay, that's 5e. But what you can do, and this is what I tend to do, is I will keep the modifier, okay, and I'll keep that, add that for your damage, and instead of rolling the dice, okay, rolling 2 dice instead of 1 dice, I just ditch one of the dice and say, no, we're not rolling the dice at all. It's just going to be an 8. So you get maximum damage on your dice. You don't have to worry about the whether it's going to be a really good roll or a really bad roll. It's always guaranteed to be maximum damage. Okay? So that's one way you can approach it if you wanted to. Some people don't like this because they usually I find I apply this system, okay? I apply this approach in a way that people get to choose before they roll how they want the damage dice to be done. Before they roll for damage, I'll say in my group, do you want to go with just maximum damage or do you want to roll the dice? And if they say maximum damage, okay, so you don't roll any dice, you get maximum damage on your dice, and you add your modifier, that's what your damage is. And if they choose not to do that, they can just roll dice as normal. It's great because people then can decide whether they think that's going to be really worth their effort or not. I find players often still prefer to roll dice, even though they know they will roll shit. It's really funny. It's really odd how that works, but it's definitely a thing. There's another way you can approach this, and that is you have your fighter has your modifier for your damage, which is say 3, and then you have 2 dice that you would normally roll. And instead of rolling those 2 dice as you normally roll for a critical hit in 5e, instead what they say is one of those dice is going to be maximum damage. But the extra dice, half of the extra dice that you have to roll, okay, if you've got multiple dice that you're rolling, half of those dice rolls that you have to make, you get to roll yourself. So there's still a random element, and you add that, okay? This will always increase the amount of damage that a critical hit will do because you are guaranteeing that one of the dice is going to be maximum damage and the other one is just like cream on top. Yep. I've really not kind of had too much of an issue with that sort of thing myself in terms of critical hits. I always think that critical hits are swingy enough that I don't need to make them any swingy than they are. But that's another way you can deal with it. I know there are some people who don't even worry. That what they will do is, okay, you get your modifier for your damage, okay, strength modifier if you're doing an attack that's melee, and you have 2 dice you get to roll, but you don't get to die and roll those dice. You double the dice, but you also get maximum damage on them. That really makes criticals pretty brutal. Like if you want to guarantee that things will die outright, that'll do it. Critical hits will kill players, characters, and monsters very quickly. It's not really my favorite approach, but you certainly could do that. There's another thing that you may not be aware of, and that is the critical hit was an odd thing in that in the past, you wouldn't necessarily roll your damage unless you could confirm your critical. So imagine you're back to 3.5, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, where you roll a 20-sided dice, you add your modifier, don't need to, it's a natural 20. But you would then have to roll a second 20-sided dice to confirm the critical, otherwise it was not a critical hit. This is how you reduce the number of critical hits that occur in your game. And basically you would have to roll a dice again, another dice again. You add that to your attack bonus, say it's 5, so I get 15. And as long as you still hit the target the second time round, it was a critical hit. It was one of the most annoying and frustrating game mechanics I've ever seen. But it certainly did, confirming a critical hit, certainly reduced the number of critical hits that occurred in the game. Getting a critical hit was really special. To be able to do that, getting that natural 20 and then having to roll it again to hit again, was a bit of a bugger. But then you do a stupendous amount of damage. And weapons had different numbers of dice. So you would the multiplier for your weapons was different. Some weapons had a multiplier of 2. Some weapons had a multiplier of 3. So you were always hoping you got a multiplier that was really big for critical hits. So that is the different critical hit systems that you could potentially use in your game if you wanted to. What has the chat got? I let them roll twice as much dice, then add what their original maximum dice would have been. So Shay's going for really heavy hitting stuff. So they get to roll twice. So if the fighter's rolling a d8, he gets 2d8. And then you're saying, and then they get to add the original maximum damage they would have, and add what the original maximum damage would have been. So if the original maximum damage would have been 8, so you're really looking at, say, so it's going to look something like this. I'm just checking to make sure I got this right here. So Shy X, you're saying your modifier, they get to add that to the damage. They get maximum damage on the 1 dice they would have rolled, but they don't get to roll that dice, and they get to double the dice that they would have normally had to roll. So these are the dice that you roll for your damage. That's a lot of damage on a critical hit. That'll kill things pretty quick. If you want to make critical hits dangerous, that'll do it, for sure. Critical rolls give double the dice versus rolling, and I still like critical hits doing maximum damage, but doubling the dice is definitely a possibility. I mean, I've seen people do that as well. Stacking, confirming. All right, so those are the different critical hit systems that you can use. Now, I want to mention another thing about critical hits. If you're going to give players critical hits, I think it's a sham to think that you shouldn't give critical hits to monsters, because it's too big of a benefit. When I saw the playtest come through and they were talking about only players could have critical hits, and only if you had a weapon in your hand, so spells couldn't critical hit with an attack roll. and monsters couldn't critical hit at all. I knew that was going to be a problem. That when you can you imagine what it would be like for a game master trying to challenge somebody under those circumstances, even if you had in recharged special abilities, because they're never going to give you enough. What you would essentially do is you'd show up, you'd run the battle, and the players would just wipe the floor of everything, and then you're done. Because the more dice you roll, the more likely to roll to critical hit. Correct? So I always thought that was a very, very foolish thing to do. I know that it would have been popular amongst some players, but I know power gamers would have hated it, not because it isn't powerful, but because they would have never been able to figure out how to make the experience enjoyable anymore. A lot of power gamers like power, and they like to win, but they don't like to win easily. And that's a big factor to consider, is people who power game, they like to win, but they don't like to win easily. I know this because I've got power gamers in my group. Okay, cover rules. Let's talk about cover rules. I always thought this was an interesting one here. Hashtag, what are your cover rules? Let's just get rid of this. I've talked about this before. Cover rules. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss the Dungeons and Dragons 5e cover rules because we should know this. If you're playing the game, you should know that already. We're talking about variations on how cover rules can work, rather than going over the basics of 5e. So there's a couple of ways that I would suggest to you that might make this more interesting. When I started out running Dungeons and Dragons 5e in a public forum, and even when it was, part of the beta test and the alpha play test, and we were playing Dungeons and Dragons, we tried to, during the alpha play test and the beta test, to use all the rules because we were testing the rules, so we had to use them. But once Dungeons and Dragons 5e was released, and I wasn't dealing with the alpha play test or the closed door private the beta test, the public beta test, and then the private alpha play test, and the rules were released, I never used cover rules at all in Dungeons and Dragons because it was another thing I needed to adjudicate. So I just ignored it completely. I know that Wally DM doesn't use cover rules at all. So if you're standing behind cover, it really doesn't give you any benefit whatsoever. You could stand out in the open, you could stand out behind cover, wouldn't matter in the slightest. So that's one way. You could just eliminate the cover rules and that would simplify your day for sure, guaranteed. But there's another way, and I don't understand why they didn't do this. And that is, imagine that you are making an attack at range, okay? And you're in cover. Somebody's in cover. So let's say I am standing behind these rocks, and I can just see over the top of them, and say I've got like half cover. Maybe if the fighter's over here, they've got 3/4 cover. Yeah, 3/4 of their body's covered. And the rogue here has got about half of their body covered. And our goblins decide to fire arrows at them. So we fire an arrow at the fighter. 3/4 of their body is covered, so they've got some cover. So you'd think with an attack roll from that goblin that it should be a little bit more difficult. And so with a short bow with a +4, this is how it might look. And you're rolling your 20-sided dice, this is how it would normally look with no cover. Yep. But if you apply cover, I just say half cover, 3/4 cover, disadvantage on the attack roll. So if the goblin's shooting at somebody in cover, whether it's half cover, shooting over here at the rogue, or shooting over here at the fighter has 3/4 cover, disadvantage. Disadvantage is just roll 2 dice and take the lowest result. So you just roll 2 of these things, right? And you take the lower result. It's the easiest way to deal with cover. You just pull half cover and 3/4 cover together. You don't sort of differentiate them, and you just say disadvantage. So you roll a 20, you roll the 7. You don't get to keep the 20, you keep the 7. 7 and 4, add that together, it comes to 11. And then you compare it to the armor class of whatever target you're firing at, whether it's be the fighter or the rogue. I think that is the simplest and easiest way, outside of not using cover rules at all, to actually run cover in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. And I really like it. I still don't understand why they haven't done this. I don't even think they provided it as a alternative rule for Dungeons and Dragons 5e. I think if you look in the Dungeon Master Guide, you won't find that there at all, which is weird. It's really strange. You could, of course, go back to the old Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 rules with cover, and God, that wasn't that much fun, frankly. I would say a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons 5e cover rules still feel very similar to the 3.5 rules. The numbers are different, but basically you're adding a number, okay, to armor class in 5e, and 3.5 you were deducting a number. That's what you were doing. You would deduct it from the attack roll rather than adding it to the armor class. It's almost identical, 3.5 and 5e. Not so much numerically, but in the approach, just one is adding and one is subtracting. Not my favorite way of approaching stuff, honestly. So I thought I would just go over that. And I've seen cover used in other games pretty effectively to make life a little bit easier for you. And again, I like advantage, disadvantage. Disadvantage is the smartest way to go. It's just so much easier to implement. Anyway, Fred Huber, what do you got here? Cover adds to armor class by 2 or 4 for, is this for having 3/4 cover. So armor class 2, yeah. Full cover means none of the targets can be directly attacked. Yeah, and that's true. That tends to be what I do. So now I just go with advantage, disadvantage, rather than going with the pluses here and minuses here. You might be thinking, well, what about dexterity saving throws? Now, with a dexterity saving throw, the easiest thing is to look at it this way and like, okay, if it's a dexterity saving throw and we're dealing with cover, we'll just change the number. Disadvantage is essentially a -5 if you're using a static number. So that would be the easiest way to apply, a dexterity saving throw to the game if you're dealing with that sort of thing and you were just wanting to go with it, just disadvantage. So yeah, you make your saving throw with disadvantage. You make your you apply -5 to the DC for your dexterity saving throw because the player's got cover, unless cover means nothing. Advantage system penalizes players with multiple sources. One disadvantage wipes out all advantages, no matter the... Yeah, but again, it is so easy to implement. There are probably too many ways that you can apply advantage in the system, but there are very few ways to apply disadvantage to the system. Do you know what I mean? So whether you like it or not, I'm just sharing what I do. Would you get cover while mounted? No, I don't think you do. I don't think the mount is providing you with cover. Do you know what I mean? You're just in a different position. Why would you get cover? I don't think that makes any sense. If anything, being on a mount would make it easier to hit you, would it not? But yeah, I don't think that a mount actually blocks you. You might say, but it blocks half of your body because you're sitting on a mount. So does turning your body to the side. So it's the same thing. I don't think it would matter. Okay, let's move on to another one, which is, and actually I'm going to do these ones really, really fast, and then I'm going to come back to character death, because character death is one of those contentious things on the web. You talk about character death and people just shit bricks. Always found this has been the case, but for those of you who are aware, and I'm sure there are some of you, things like opportunity attacks were a thing. Okay, basically opportunity attacks were treated as when you do something that moves you away from the enemy, or does something that would potentially threaten you by doing so. So I'm just going to talk about opportunity attacks. Opportunity attacks. Or attacks of opportunity. Doesn't really matter how you word it. It's the same thing, really. Okay. I've never been fond of bringing back the Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 attack of opportunity or attack or opportunity attack. It's never been something that I wanted to do. There were so many different things that would trigger an attack by the enemy, okay, if you did something. It was so common to happen, particularly if you were up close. Being up close was bad. Everything like literally seemed to trigger an attack of opportunity, and I didn't really see much point in covering that. Z height, I honestly don't know that matters. Amount is not that high. Hashtag what your opportunity attack rules. Here we go. There we go. Let's put that in there. Sorry, people. I should have done that first. Now I have. So I've been part of real fighting in the past. And one of the things that always gets my goat is that I don't think game designers understand real fighting, which is weird because I know that Chris Perkins had some input into game rules. And so he's involved in mixed martial arts. And so he should understand how it works and how an opportunity attack and the reality of the world would work. Jeremy Crawford, probably not. Mike Mills, probably not. I don't think they have any fighting experience whatsoever. Okay? So maybe Chris Perkins never had enough of an impact or say about how opportunity attacks would work in 5e. So this is my view. If you just move away from an enemy, and this is in 5e how you provoke an attack of opportunity, I just don't even bother now, because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I've just eliminated this thing completely. I just don't even bother with it. We used to have the 5-foot step where you could move 1 square or 5 feet without provoking, and then anything else you would do would provoke. So you could slowly move yourself into position to flank, but flanking rules are not a thing in 5e unless you're using the optional rule, so it's kind of pointless. I just don't see that there's any necessity for it. And since my game very rarely uses flanking rules, moving around the enemy is not a big deal. Moving away and trying to escape, you almost never can escape in 5e because of the opportunity attack. Because if you disengage, whether it be a monster or a player, quite often you're going to get somebody's going to run up to you and attack you again, and you can never get away. But if you can just run and move and dash, then you can. That means that the cleric can now move whatever they need to, or the fighter can go 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and then move, that's their move, and then use their action to dash and go 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so they can get further away than they would be able to before. And we don't worry about diagonals or anything like that. I just don't think it's worth concerning yourself with. So now you can actually escape a fight, unless somebody moves faster than you. Do you know what I mean? But right now you really can't. If you think about the logic behind the opportunity attack, since I just don't think there's any point in worrying about having them come into play, when you move away from somebody, it's usually that circumstance is the last thing that's going to provoke. So I don't even bother using it at all. Moving away doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity. If you've had to learn how to fight on the ground and you're prone, so for example, imagine you are prone and you're fighting somebody. So the fighter's prone. Would standing up provoke an attack of opportunity? This is in real fights. This is the one time that it makes sense that an opportunity attack might provoke an attack of opportunity, unless you have been trained how to do so. Okay, and I do not mean the flip onto your feet nonsense, because the flip onto your feet will get your head kicked in. okay, or a sword shoved through your gut as you move forward, because you're going back and then forward, so you have to always move backwards when you're trying to get up. And if you are taught how to do it properly, you can get up without getting hit, unless they have a very long weapon, or they're just much faster than you are. So this is really the only time potentially getting up is going to be an attack of opportunity. There might be another circumstance where somebody might be able to capitalize that, and that's picking something up. So when you have something on the ground and you pick it up, leaning forward, if you're right next to somebody who's got a weapon or can punch or kick you, then it makes sense that maybe an opportunity attack occurs. But because they're not using those sorts of things in 5e, and I have no desire to bring them back, I just didn't see there be any point in using opportunity attacks at all. Okay, but moving away is the safest and easiest way to get away, particularly if you just back up. If you turn around and put your back to somebody and walk away from them, yeah, they're going to punch you in the back of the head or shove a weapon in your back, in your spine. But other than that, it's kind of like a pointless mechanic, and I just wanted to sort of mention that. Hello Jasper, how are you? My battle cat has advantage. You're 3/4 cover. My rules for opportunity attacks is this: you have the opportunity to roll for your attack during your side's initiative. Okay, all right, interesting. Okay, so that's that one. Let's do let's get rid of another thing off the cards here. Oh, inspiration. I actually want to do inspiration. I should do character death, but can I just say right now, do you know inspiration where you get to roll advantage on a dice roll? I always like the idea that you could have advantage on your N20-sided dice roll. You could give it to somebody else. How you get advantage, from your inspiration, how you earn it. Frankly, I think it should be completely up to the game master, because everybody's running inspiration differently if they're using inspiration at all. There are so many ways to get inspiration, well, should I say advantage on a dice roll nowadays, whether it's a spell or doing something. Bardic inspiration is a good example of this. There's so many different ways of getting inspiration where you roll 2 dice and take the higher result in 5e that inspiration has almost become kind of pointless in my game. My players often, even when they have it, will not use it. Why is that? Because usually they are successful. Their characters are built to succeed. So I always felt like inspiration works best when the game master can award it for whatever the hell they like. It doesn't matter. And you can apply the inspiration, the advantage to your own dice roll, to somebody else's dice roll. Really popular was applying it to disadvantage to, instead of advantage, but applying disadvantage to the game master's dice roll. I found that was an interesting one. But you've got to pick your timing. Timing is always important with a dice roll for advantage or disadvantage, right? So if you don't stipulate there's a time to do that and a time not to do that, it can be kind of abused a little bit. So anyway, so this is the next thing I want to kind of chat about. I will do character death, but I just wanted to mention inspiration very, very quickly. Next, damage output, monster damage, hashtag how do you do monster damage? How do you do monster damage? So I want to give you an example of how I do monster damage very quickly. And I'm changing this because my players are getting better and better at playing 5e, and so I have to keep changing how it works. So monster damage. Here we go. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do monster damage right now. First one is when the monster does something with their scimitar and makes an attack against the fighter. Okay, so they hit and they're going to do damage. And you look on your damage output for this is a 6-sided dice. Okay, right, they get a 6-sided dice and they're going to roll that and they're going to add 2. They're going to add 2 to that dice roll. So they do that. Okay, that's how much damage you do. The problem is if you have a bunch of monsters, the game master's got to do that multiple times if you're doing it separately for every single monster. there is the possibility of just rolling dice once for all the monsters that do damage, and you sweeten the pie and make it a little bit easier. But there's a reason why 5e has average damage listed outside in brackets, which basically just says you do 5 points of damage. So when a goblin hits you with a scimitar, it does 5 points of damage. When it shoots you with a bow, it does 5 points of damage. I found that didn't work in my game because, one, the monsters in 5e are pussies. They're not very good. Do you know what I mean? They don't really do enough damage. And even at low level is the only time that your players are really particularly weak. At higher levels, that they just get stronger and stronger and stronger. So this is what I normally do, is I will have the average damage, I'll keep that for my goblins, and then I'll roll a 6-sided dice. So every time they make an attack, I add 5 to whatever I roll, and this just increases the amount of damage. Every type of attack they do, every monster that I have average damage that I'm using, I'll add a 6-sided dice roll. So the damage that they do is always slightly different, but not by much. It's only a difference of 1 to 6 points. And my players have coped for years doing that. I am probably going to be switching over to an 8-sided dice rather than a 6-sided dice. I might even consider going over to a 10-sided dice when I add it to average damage. Just because my players can cope with it. They've figured out how to increase their armor class, increase their hit points, cast spells that reduce it, stop incoming attacks. I mean, all sorts of things. There's, so this is why I tend to do damage very differently than I used to in the past. And it's partly to do with my own group, but partly to do with the fact that, D&D 5e after a while is not that hard. It's kind of like an easy mode. Yeah, rolling damage or not rolling damage. Yeah. So, did you know that Chris Perkins uses the method of using average damage and rolls a 6-sided dice and adds that to the damage? He does that. That's his default for running monsters and doing damage. If you were wondering, that's actually how he does it. Okay, now dealing with character death. Hashtag. How do you deal with character death? How do you deal with character death? So let's have a look at some of the things that you can do with that. And I'm going to just jump this over here. Character death is one of those interesting things. I've changed my views on about how I deal with character death a few times now. But I've come to the conclusion that the best way of dealing with character death is the way that the players want to deal with it. And I know for some people that might be a problem, but I'm going to present a couple of different ways. Character death. So whether you're dealing with Dungeons & Dragons 5e or a different version of the game, there's definitely a couple of ways you can approach it. When I started playing Dungeons & Dragons, if a character went down and they died, they were dead, and you made a new character. You see that character sheet that you've got there? Okay, sometimes it would get ripped up, sometimes it would just be filed away, and you would have some grief over it, and another character would be written up or made, and it would just drop out of the ceiling or the sky and continue adventuring with you. Sometimes we made up a narrative reason why the character died and you had to have a new character come into play. Yeah, you're gone, and now there is a monk. Okay, all right. So, and that's fine. But there's nothing special or impressive about that method. It's been touted for years as being the way to do things, and I'm sure it's for some people it might be, but honestly, I don't see any weight in it because I've tried it and I kind of gave up on it. So I have a different way of dealing with it. That is the three-pronged approach. There's a three-pronged approach that you can have. Okay? Three-pronged approach is 1. The players can choose when their character falls to 0 hit points that they are knocked out. Yep, they're knocked out. So continuing to attack them would be pointless. They're going to be knocked out. They're out of play for that battle. They're knocked out. Or number 2, they're dead. They decide when they hit 0 hit points, they're dead. They're finished with that character. They will go make a new character. Number 3 is, no, my character, when it falls to 0 hit points, they're not unconscious and knocked out and stable, which is the first one. They're not dead. They are dying. So there's going to be some sort of thing that happens. Now, whether that is a dice roll to determine how many rounds they live before they die completely, or whether you roll a 20-sided dice and you have like a death saving throw, just like in 5e. But you can run all 3 systems, believe it or not, on the same table. So you could have, and I've done it before. You can have every single player decide to run death rules differently for their character. Because I know a lot of people believe that character death is the worst consequence that you can possibly have with your character. I can assure you, you're not using your imagination very well if you think that character death is the worst thing that can happen to the player's characters. Because it ain't. It definitely ain't. There are much worse things that can happen. I can assure you. And I've done them. Go play Curse of Strahd and you'll figure that one out. Anyway, so you can run all 3 systems on the same table with the same group, so that this way it tailors it to every player and how they would like character death to work. Because some people like the idea that they can't die and they just want their character knocked out and they'll come back into the game in the next battle. Some people don't like that and they want their character to die because they feel like it's important to them, and so they will make up a new character. They're ready to go. They'll be fine. They've probably got a folder full of them ready to go. They don't want their character to die sometimes. And then others want there to be a chance that they might be able to get back up in the fight. Okay, they still don't want to be, they don't want to sit there and wait. So you can do it a number of different ways. And it's funny that you can do all of them all at the same time. One of the reasons why I gave up as a game master, worrying and concerning myself about how players come back into the game, is a couple of different things. One, I realised that people's understanding and view of character death differs widely. And I've played with a lot of different people. People who have played for many years, are in sort of in their 50s and 60s, and people who are very new to the game. Who, you know, my nephew taught me, and he was like a teenager, taught me a lot of very useful rules, very useful lessons, not rules, but lessons about what happens when people's character dies. Yes, you can make a new character. Yes, you can look, fantasy Dungeons and Dragons, you can bring characters back to life with spells and magic. So why get too concerned about what's happening when you hit 0 hit points? Reincarnate is one of the things in my home group that is the favorite thing to select. They just start chanting, reincarnate, reincarnate. Let's find out if we bring them back to life what they come back as. And they'll cut off a finger and just leave the body and go off, and reincarnate's now in play. Or if a character dies but they want to keep playing that character, I can bring that character back into the game a variety of different ways. Sometimes they might have a missing arm, or a permanent injury, or an injury that could be eliminated in the future with magic or a quest or something like that. Or maybe they come back as a zombie or a ghost. I've done this before. So bringing players back into the game, character death is more about how do you bring a character back into play. Or should I say, how to bring a player back into play. Because a character dead, player is no longer part of the equation, right? They're not really there to play anymore. They're now they're just an observer. And part of the reason why I did this is I did this because I watched my nephew one day, who was very new to Dungeons and Dragons. His character died. Now, whether he did it because he did something silly or not is beside the point. It's unimportant as far as I was concerned. But what he did is he made another character, because I told him, make another character. And at that time, I was of the view that when your character died, you had to make another character. And I viewed that what he did with his character was foolish and he deserved to die. That's what I was thinking. So he just wrote number 2 beside the character sheet and continued to play exactly the same character. Now I could have been a dick and said, no, you have to go and make another character. You can't do that. But he wouldn't have wanted to play. He's a teenager. He wouldn't have wanted to play. He said, oh, screw it, I'm going to go. But also, too, you got to understand is bringing in a new character in Dungeons & Dragons 5e is a long process. If you make it with paper and pencil, it takes forever. It's an hour and a half of your time to make a new character unless you have a stack of characters ready to go if your character dies. So in other words, unless you have some stand-ins to come into play. So it's a lot of investment. It's not like basic Back Me D&D where you can make a character pretty quickly. Even basic Back Me D&D takes a bit of time to make a character. I think Shadow Dark is faster myself. So I realized that day when he did that I was holding on to how death worked too much. And when I realized that you can run character death at your table with the same people in the same group and the same game session 3 different ways, I realized that I'd solved all my problems. No longer was I the one who had to sit there and watch somebody argue with me about character death, or start crying, or decide to get upset and just not come back to the game again because their character died, and they wanted to keep playing the same character because they got attached to it. I could run character death 3 different ways at the same table. It solved me a lot of problems. I don't suffer any kind of stresses around character death anymore. So yes, there are lots of different ways you can do it, and you can do the different ones in different ways at the same time. It's just strange, isn't it? Because you think about it, Dungeons & Dragons 5e, you can have some players who use feats and some players who don't use feats, and they're all playing at the same table. And you might say, yes, but the people using feats are probably going to have a better character. It's going to be stronger, but they can still play at the same table. The person not using feats has at least accepted the fact that they're not using feats. They were given the option. So people can actually cater it, players can actually cater it to how they want to do things. Grief. Shy X. Jasper, I like your idea of giving the players the choice of what rules to use for character death. Yeah. And that's why I'm presenting it today, because, I kind of do this, but I also wanted to point out you can do it. Dungeons & Dragons is not realism. This is the first thing I always try to remind myself, okay? If I think that I've got to always remind myself that if I start thinking about realism in Dungeons & Dragons, I need to start taking medication. And I'm probably suffering from some of the problems that my clientele have when I go to my day job at Goodwood Park. Clearly, it is time for the clozapam, clozapine, lorazepam, diazepam, all the PAMs, I'm going to take a PAM medication time. There are a billion ways to story-wise bring a character back from death. Yes, there is. I've had whole groups who played as dead characters too. That's happened to me too as well, by the way, people. HB0 unconscious, you continue to bleed out 1 H point DM per turn, unless stabilized by a healing kit or healing spell. Once character is at minus 10 hit points, they're dead. Yeah, we used to track, at 3.5 we used to track negative hit points. I'm kind of glad we don't do that now. You could bring back the 3.5 death rolls if you wanted into 5e. I just don't know that there's any point. It's an old concept, and it was always cumbersome, unless, of course, that's the sort of thing you want. Playing 5e makes all the difference for the reasons you stated. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, thank you, Matthew. I am out of time. I need to go. I will not be talking about game mechanics for Dungeons & Dragons 5e like this, or doing demonstrations. Probably won't be doing it for a very long time. I would be surprised if I do it again this year. I really don't think it's very likely. So this was the first and only time this year that I intend to go back to 5e. I am probably going to I'm going to start talking about and demonstrating. It's either going to be for me Star Wars Saga Okay, I would like to go back to going over and talking about and demonstrating Star Wars Saga. I found there were a lot of people who liked that. I am keen to do Shadow Dark again because I feel like I may have made a couple of mistakes along the way, and so because I haven't played it that much, it would be nice for me to revisit Shadow Dark. I would like to do that. The other one that I would like to revisit, and that is Back Me Basic Dungeons and Dragons. I would very much like to go to that one as well and look at how that runs. Another one that I would like to do, but I haven't done it before and I'm still trying to get my head around it, is Morkborg. I would like to do that. It's a very simple system. Another one that I haven't done and I'm actually afraid to do is actually Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I don't really want to do it because I'm a little bit afraid of that system. And another one that I can do and I have done in the past is Dungeons and Dragons 4e. So going over the rules for Dungeons and Dragons 4e, I would be willing to do that. I don't know that I want to do Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, and the reason I don't want to do Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 is because it's so similar to everything else, and it is an antique game system now, and I mean, antique game systems haven't been like we shouldn't do it on this channel. That's just definitely not what I was thinking. But I'm very keen on revisiting some of these. So I probably will be doing Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 at some point. I don't think I'll be revisiting and trying to do Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think that's likely. I would like to do sagas, but I don't think I have enough skill. And I would really like to do Super Atomic that AJ's been working on, but again, I don't think I have the skill for that yet. Not to do it in a live stream. So we'll see how we go. So we're probably going to be revisiting either Star Wars Saga, Shadow Dark, Back Me Dungeons and Dragons, or Dungeons and Dragons 4e in the near future. But sometime in the year, I'll probably build in some of these other ones. I need a bit of time to get my head around them. That's all. Okay, so for those of you who are wondering what was going on, that's kind of what's going on. Oh, there's also a Dungeons and Dragons Lego game system, and I am actually very interested, since it's so simple, in presenting that on the channel. I would like to do that. And if I get a chance, and I feel like I am confident in doing so, I might put that forward because I would like more kids to be able to play the game. So yeah, that's what I was thinking. Anyway, we are done for today. I am done. You are done. I've got to go to work. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's been watching and listening. Hopefully this was useful or interesting to you in some way. I want to thank all of my patrons. I want to thank everybody who took part in the poll. Do you have house or homebrew rules for Dungeons and Dragons? Yes, 78%. I'm not surprised. No, 14%. Just watching, 7% out of 14 votes. Cool. And those of you who've been in the chat commenting, appreciate it. Jasper AK, Cal Rowell, Matthew, Fred Huber, Shy X. I believe we had was he here today? I can't remember. Osiris was here. Jeeves was here. Great to have you. And Fred Huber's been very active in the chat today, and so has Shy X. And I do appreciate that because it's nice to have you sharing your ideas. How we run our games is only up to us, and it has nothing to do with anybody else. So it's all right to run your games differently. Every game master in my home group runs Dungeons and Dragons 5e differently. We use different rules. So it's all right. Okay, so even if you think I'm beating up on how you do it, it's not at all the case, because I have to adapt to every single game master in my table. That's just how it is, and they have to adapt to me. So wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, the afternoon, or the night, please look after yourself, your family, and your friends. Be nice to your neighbours, and hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.